Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, I'm going to share with you my thoughts on which translation of Homer's Iliad you should own and read. Homer's Iliad is the grand epic of the Western tradition. Its influence is immense. It has touched all subsequent Western literature, from Virgil down through Shakespeare to modern tales of war, conquest, of love, peace, and compassion. There are many translations of Homer's Iliad: poetic, prose, modern, archaic. Two translations stand out in their ability to retain an element of the Homeric poetic tradition and their affordability and their readability. And that is Richmond Lattimore's translation from 1951 and Robert Fagles' translation from the 1990s. They each have their pros and cons. Richmond Lattimore's translation, since it's from 1951, has some slightly archaic spelling and language in it for those unfamiliar with the more traditional translated spellings of Greek names. For instance, Achilles is spelled with an E-U-S. Hector's name is spelled with a K rather than a C. But what makes Lattimore's translation so great is the poetic nature to it. After all, Richmond Lattimore wasn't just a classicist, he was a poet. And in producing a remarkable translation of the Iliad, as well as the Odyssey, Lattimore sought to retain as much of the poetic sublime within the Homeric language. Furthermore, another great asset to Lattimore's translation is, perhaps also a drawback, so it's a double-edged sword, is how he refers to the Greek names in their traditional Greek context. For instance, he refers to the realm of the dead as Hades. He gives the names to the morning stars and the other great gods and divinities that populated the Greek cosmos and mind. Lattimore's translation assumes that there is some reader knowledge of Greek culture, history, and tradition. Fagles' translation, by contrast, doesn't assume the reader to have any knowledge of the Greek tradition. And this is a result of the decline, sadly, of classics and humanities in Western culture. In the 1950s, an educated person would have been familiar with the Greek tradition. By the 1990s, an educated person probably hadn't read a Greek text whatsoever. Fagles attempts to correct this problem in modern Western society, especially the United States, by offering a very accessible and readable translation of Homer, which retains a strong element of Homeric poetry in it. And to highlight the differences between Lattimore and Fagles, I will now read a couple of selections within the Iliad so that you can have a better understanding of the differences of approach between two of the great translations that you can have of the Iliad. I will read the opening verses as well as sections from the famous duel between Hector and Achilles. So this is in Lattimore's translation, the famous opening verses. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds. And the will of Zeus was accomplished, since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. And here is Fagles' translation of these opening lines. Rage, goddess, Sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion feasts for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, Muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. So immediately what you should have heard is how both translations have a high spirit of poetry to them. Fagles does not sacrifice too much poetry in bringing a more readable and accessible version to moderns in the late 20th and 21st century. Yet you will have also noticed that Fagles does not translate the realm of death as Hades. He simply calls it the house of death, where Lattimore provides the actual Greek name, Hades, to it. This is common throughout the translation from Lattimore and Fagles, as already mentioned. And I think you would agree that Lattimore's is slightly more poetic, despite the slight archaic nature of the language. And now, to highlight the grand contrast between the two, we turn to the epic duel between Hector and Achilles. I start here, again, by reading Lattimore's translation. But swift Achilles kept unremittingly after Hector, chasing him as a dog in the mountains, who has flushed from his covert. A deer's fawn follows him through the folding ways and the valleys. And though the fawn crouch down under a bush and be hidden, he keeps running and noses him out until he comes. So Hector could not lose himself from swift-footed Pelion. If ever he made a dash, right on for the gates of Dardanos, to get quickly under the strong-built bastions, endeavoring that they from above with missiles thrown might somehow defend him. Each time Achilles would get in front and force him to turn back into the plain, and himself kept his flying course next to the city. As in a dream, a man is not able to follow one who runs from him, nor can the runner escape, nor the other pursue him. So he could not run him down in his speed, nor the other get clear. How then could Hector have escaped the death spirits, had not Apollo, for this time and last time, stood by him close, and driven strength into him, and made his knees light? But brilliant Achilles kept shaking his head at his own people, and would not let them throw their bitter projectiles at Hector, for fear the thrower might win the glory, and himself come second. But when for the fourth time they had come around to the well springs, then the father balanced his golden scales, and in them he set two fateful portions of death, which lays men prostrate, one for Achilles and one for Hector, breaker of horses, and balanced it by the middle. And Hector's death day was heavier, and dragged downward to death, and Phoebus Apollo forsook him. But the goddess grey-eyed Athena came now to Pelion, and stood close beside him. I'll skip forward here to the battle. So he spoke, and balanced the spear, far shadowed, and threw it. But glorious Hector kept his eyes on him, and avoided it, for he dropped, watchful, to his knee, and the bronze spear flew over his shoulder, and stuck in the ground. But Pallas Athena snatched it, and gave it back to Achilles, unseen by Hector, shepherd of his people. But now Hector spoke out to the blameless son of Peleus. You missed, and it was not, O Achilles, like the immortals from Zeus, that you knew my destiny. But you thought so, or rather you are someone clever in speech, and you spoke to swindle me, to make me afraid of you, and forget my valor and war strength. You will not stick your spear in my back as I run away from you, but drive it into my chest as I storm straight in against you, if the gods give you that. And now look out for my brazen spear. I wish it might be taken full length in your body. And indeed the war would be lighter for the Trojans if you were dead, seeing that you are their greatest affliction. So he spoke, and balanced the spear far shadowed and threw it, and struck the middle of Pallades' shield, nor missed it. But the spear was driven back from afar, and Hector was angered, because his swift weapon had been loosed from his hand in a vain cast. He stood discouraged, and had no other ash spear, but lifting his voice, he called aloud on Deiphobus of the pale shield, and he asked him for a long spear. But Deiphobus was not near him, and Hector knew the truth inside his heart, and spoke aloud, "No use. Here at last the gods have summoned me deathward. I thought Deiphobus the hero was here close beside me, but he is beside the wall, and it was Athena cheating me. And now evil death is close at hand, and no longer far away, and there is no way out. So it must long since have been pleasing to Zeus and Zeus's son, who strikes from afar. Though before this they defended me gladly. But now my death is upon me. Let me at least not die without a struggle, inglorious, but do some big thing first, that men of all ages shall come to know it." So he spoke, and pulling out the sharp sword that was slung at the hollow of his side, huge and heavy, and gathering himself, he made his swoop, like a high-flown eagle who launches himself out of the murk of the clouds onto the flat land to catch away a tender lamb or a shivering hare. So Hector made his swoop, swinging his sharp sword, and Achilles charged, the heart within him loaded with savage fury. In front of his chest, the beautiful, elaborate great shield covered him, and with the glittering helm with 4 horns he nodded. The lovely golden fringes were shaken about it, which Hephaestus had driven close along the horn of the helmet. And as the star moves among stars in the night's darkening, Hesper, who is the fairest star who stands in the sky, such was the shining from the pointed spear of Achilles that he was shaking in his right hand with evil intention toward brilliant Hector. He was eyeing Hector's splendid body to see where it might best give way, but all the rest of the skin was held in armor, brazen and splendid. He stripped when he cut down the strength of Patroclus, yet showed where the collar bones hold the neck from the shoulders, the throat, where death of the soul comes most swiftly. In this place, brilliant Achilles drove the spear as he came on in fury, and clean through the soft part of the neck the spear point was driven. Yet the ash spear, heavy with bronze, did not sever the windpipe, so that Hector could still make exchange of words spoken, but he dropped in the dust, and brilliant Achilles vaunted over him. "Hector, surely you thought, as you killed Patroclus, you would be safe, and since I was far away, you thought nothing of me. O fool, for an avenger was left, far greater than he was, behind him, and away by the hollow ships, and it was I, and I have broken your strength. On you the dogs and vultures shall feed, and foully rip you up, and the Achaeans will bury Patroclus." And here you will see the contrast in Fagles. Again, you will note the naming difference between the Greek divinities in Lattimore and Fagles. And swift Achilles kept on cursing Hector non-stop, as a hound in the mountains starts a fawn from its lair, hunting him down through the gorges, down the narrow glens, and the fawn goes to the ground, hiding deep in the bushes, but the hound comes racing fast, nosing him out, until he lands his kill. So Hector could never throw Achilles off his trail. The swift racer Achilles, time and again, he'd make a dash for the Dardan gates, trying to rush beneath the rock-built ramparts, hoping men on the heights might save him, somehow. Raining spears, but time and again, Achilles would intercept him quickly, heading him off, forcing him out across the plain, and always sprinting along the city side himself, endless as in a dream. When a man can't catch another fleeing on ahead, and he can never escape, nor his rival overtake him. So the one could never run the other down in his speed, nor the other spring away. And how could Hector have fled the fates of death so long? How, unless one last time, one final time, Apollo had swept in close beside him, driving strength in his legs and knees to race the wind. And brilliant Achilles shook his head at the armies, never letting them hurl their spears at Hector, for someone might snatch the glory, and Achilles come in second. But once they reached the springs for the fourth time, there Father Zeus held out his sacred golden scales. In them he placed two fates of death that lays men low, one for Achilles, and one for Hector, breaker of horses. And gripping the beam mid-haft, the father raised it high, and down went Hector's day of doom, dragging him down to the strong house of death, and god Apollo left him. Athena rushed to Achilles, her bright eyes gleaming. With that shaft poise he hurled, and his spear long shadow flew, but seeing it coming, glorious Hector ducked away, crouching down, watching the bronze tip fly past and stab the earth. But Athena snatched it up and passed it back to Achilles, and Hector, the gallant captain, never saw her. He sounded out a challenge to Peleus' princely son. "You miss. Look, the great godlike Achilles, so you knew nothing at all from Zeus about my death. And yet how sure you were, all bluff, cunning with words. That's all you are, trying to make me fear you, lose my nerve, forget my fighting strength. Well, you'll never plant your lance in my back as I flee you in fear, but plunge it through my chest as I come charging in, if a god gives you the chance. But now it's for you to dodge my brazen spear. I wish you'd bury it in your body to the hilt. How much lighter the war would be for the Trojans then, if you, their greatest scourge, were dead and gone." Shaft poised, he hurled his spear's long shadow flew, and it struck Achilles' shield, a dead center hit, but off and away it glanced, and Hector seethed his hurtling spear, his whole arm's power poured into a wasted shot. He stood there, cast down. He had no spear in reserve. So Hector shouted out to Deiphobus, bearing his white shield. With a ringing shout he called for a heavy lance, but the man was nowhere near him, vanished. Yes, and Hector knew the truth in his heart, and the fighter cried aloud, "My time has come. At last the gods have called me down to death." I thought he was at my side, the hero Deiphobus. He's safe inside the walls. Athena's tricked me blind. And now death, grim death, is looming up beside me, no longer far away. No way to escape it now. This was their pleasure after all, sealed long ago. Zeus and the son of Zeus, the distant deadly archer, though often before now they rushed to my defense. So now I meet my doom. Well, let me die, but not without struggle, not without glory. No, in some great clash of arms, that even men down through the ages will come to hear it. And on that resolve he drew the whetted sword that hung at his side, tempered, massive, and gathering all his force he swooped like a soaring eagle, launching down from the dark clouds to earth, to snatch some helpless lamb or trembling hare. So Hector swooped now, swinging his whetted sword, and Achilles charged too, bursting with rage, barbaric, guarding his chest with the well-wrought blazoned shield, head tossing, his gleaming helmet, 4 horns strong, and the golden plume shook that the god of fire drove in bristling thick along its ridge. Bright as the star amid the stars in the night sky, star of the evening, brightest star that rides the heavens, so fire flared from the sharp point of Achilles' spear, brandished high in his right hand, bent on Hector's death, scanning his body, where to pierce it best. The rest of his flesh seemed all encased in armor, burnished and brazen, Achilles' armor that Hector stripped from strong Patroclus when he killed him. True, but one spot lay exposed, where collarbones lift the neckbone off the shoulder, the open throat, where the end of life comes quickest. There, as Hector charged in fury brilliant, Achilles drove his spear, and the point went stabbing clean through the tender neck. But the heavy bronze weapon failed to slash the windpipe. Hector could still gasp out some words, some last reply, as he crashed to the dust. And godlike Achilles gloried over him. Hector, surely you thought when you stripped Patroclus' armor that you would be safe, never a fear of me, far from the fighting as I was, you fool. Left behind there, down by the beaked ships, his great avenger waited, a greater man by far, and that man was I, and I smashed your strength. And you, the dogs and birds will maul you, shame your corpse, while the Achaeans bury my dear friend in glory. As you can see, Lattimore and Fagles both attempt to provide a poetic translation for readers. Yet Lattimore's is arguably the more poetic. It retains a higher rhetoric and linguistic sublime, and it retains an honest naming of the Greek culture, the gods, the divinities, the cosmos. Lattimore, even though he assumes the reader to have knowledge of Greek culture and history and the Homeric context, remains a wonderful read just for its language. Fagles', however, also comes with a great advantage for those not familiar with Greek culture and history. The introduction by Bernard Knox, the great classicist of the previous generation, provided in just over 60 pages what is widely considered one of the finest in-depth yet concise introductions to Homer's Iliad. In fact, Knox's introduction, included in Fagles' translation, is regarded as one of his finest works of scholarship. If you do not have an extensive knowledge of Greek culture and the Homeric context, Fagles' translation is probably the best for you. If, however, you already own multiple translations of Homer, as I own multiple translations of Homer, and are looking for something deeply poetic and sublime, you should buy Lattimore's translation. But if you do not have any translation of Homer, you should own both, because in reading Fagles, you will gain a great entry point into the Homeric world, and then in reading Lattimore, you will discover some of the poetic splendor that Homer produced in composing his great epic. For it is not only the actions of the heroes of antiquity that should guide us to the stars, it is the poetic splendor of the great writers, the singers, the muses, that ought to inspire us to the lofty heights of heaven. Our souls are not only nourished by imitation of heroes, they are nourished and matured through the imitation of beauty. And Lattimore's translation, among all the other translations available, in my opinion, retains the highest beauty of any translation of Homer's Iliad.